welcome to Siska Stitches channel. Today's video is going to be about how to cut and sew a wrap dress. So if you are here and you are not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. There are a lot of things to learn on this channel. Turn on the bell so that whenever I post new videos, you'll be the first to know. So what we're going to do first is to do our measurements on a pattern paper before moving it onto your fabric. So what we are going to do is to come here. I'm going to mark armhole divided by 2 first, and for me mine is 18 divided by 2 is 9 inches, and I will mark my bust point. My bust point is 10.5. We don't need under bust for wrap dress. I'm going to go with half length of 17 inches. So what I'm going to do is to just draw a line across this point. So I'm going to come right at the top here and mark the shoulder measurement divided by 2, and mine is 8 inches. So 16 divided by 2, 8. So I mark 8 here. I'll be going with a neck width of 4, so I'll mark 4 inches here. I'll come right here, mark my 1 inch for shoulder slant. Okay, so it's right here. Just connect it like this. So the 8 inches that I marked here, from here to here, I'll come right here and do the same thing. Mark that 8 inches, connect it like this. Okay, connect like this. I'm going to come right here, find the midpoint, which is 4, go in by half an inch right here. So on this place, I'll mark my bust circumference. My bust circumference is 37, and 37 divided by 4 is 9.25. So I'll come right here, mark 9.25. And we're going to connect this part like this with our French curve. If you can use your free hand, go ahead and do that, but I would advise that you use a curved ruler to give you a more so this is what we have. For the back, we are going to go with a neck depth of 1 inch or 1.5. That's what I'll be going with, and just go ahead and curve it out to this point here. Can use a French curve for this part as well. This back part will be cut on fold, so you need to take note. Okay, so it's cut on fold, and I'm going to come to my waist now. My waist circumference is 34 divided by 4 is 8.5. So I'll come right here and mark that 8.5 inches. We're going to add 1 inch for that, so I'll come right here, mark that 1 inch. You can equally go with 1.5 inches for your dart, and I'll connect here to, that's waist to bust. So just like this. Now I'm going to come at this part. We're going to mark our bust span. Bust span is 8 divided by 2 is 4, so I mark 4 here. I come to the bust point, I mark 4 inches, and I'm going to draw a straight line. Okay, I'm going to draw a straight line right there. Mark my dart allowance. I gave 1 inch here, so I'm going to come here. I'll mark half an inch on both sides, just like this. And we are going to connect our darts. So this would help us in drafting the front of our pattern. So now that we have finished with the back, what we are going to do next is to cut out our pattern. So I want to advise that for your front pattern, make sure that your pattern paper is 2 times your back pattern, okay? Because there's a way we are going to be drafting out the front. Oh crap. So just a quick one, my brain actually registered that I was drafting a front pattern, meanwhile this is the back pattern. And for my back patterns, I don't do my armhole like this. Take note of that correction. For my back pattern, I just go on to curve it out from this point here, okay, to the line there. I don't go in by half an inch. It's my front pattern that I'm going to go in by half an inch. So it was wrong for me to cut that out. So I'm just glad I remembered that before. You see why it's always good to draft patterns before cutting it out on fabric. So I'll just go on to cut this out like this. Okay. Then cut out the shoulder slope and then my neckline. Seam allowances will be added right on fabric. So now that this is done, we're going to go ahead and move to the front pattern. So in order to draft the front pattern, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to fold my pattern paper into 2. So I place the back pattern right on top, just like this. And then I'm going to cut out my pattern. Just follow this line here, the side seam just cut out the armhole. You can make adjustments to the armhole later. Cut out the armhole and the shoulder slope. We're not going to touch our neckline. When I go on to remove my pattern, I'll just come right at this middle of the armhole and create a notch so that it will be easy for me to, draft out the front armhole. Come right at the neckline area, make a notch as well, okay, so that we know where we are carving out our neckline from. So what we're going to do next is to open up our pattern, and this is what we have. I'll come to one of the side seam. What I'm going to do is to mark 2.5 inches upwards like this, okay. Connect this 2.5 inch mark to this neck width here, okay. Remember that I notched it on the pattern paper earlier, so that is what we want to do. And you can decide to use a curve to connect it to this point, or you can go straight. So I want to quickly mention something, that if you are going to connect it straight up, your neckline is going to be sort of like a lot closed, okay. But if you want it open, you can go ahead and go with a curve. And you should not go with a curve that is too deep. If you go with a curve that is too deep, your neckline area is going to be too open. So just try and sort of like go with a slight curve. I'm going to use a pencil to sort of like gauge that first, okay. Just go ahead and use a pencil for yours, before going on to use a marker pen to draft anything out. So I think I'm okay with this. This is sort of like a little bit curved here and it's sort of moving straight up. So I'm definitely fine with this, because the neck too will come like this. So this is, going to form like a neck depth of about 6 inches. So this is fine for me. I'll just go on to use my marker pen to trace out what I have done here. So you can see that it has a slight curve like this. And what we are going to do right now is to cut this out. So this is forming only 1/2 of the front bodice. You actually need to cut this in two to have one for the left and for the right side. Okay, so this is what I have for mine. What I'm going to do is to come right around the armhole. Remember that I notched this part. So I'm going to mark 1/2 inch inwards like this, so we can create the front armhole, and then I'll connect it like this. Connect it like this, connect it like this, and go on to cut this part out. And after cutting the front armhole, what we are going to do next is to mark where the dart is, okay. So using the back pattern as a guide, I'm just going to mark the points there. So I mark the midpoint, I mark this point, I mark this point. And what I'm going to do for the upper part of my dart is to use a pin to get this part. So the pin point is going to show on the paper. All I just need to do is to connect it to the pin point like this, okay. So we have our darts all marked out. Next thing I'm going to do is to go on to cut this out on fabric, and I will be adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around my pattern on the fabric, okay. So after cutting out my front and back pieces, this is what I have. So at the end of the day, you should have 1 piece for the back, okay, because we cut it on fold, and 2 pieces for the front because it's going to be open in front. We're making a wrap dress. So what I'm going to do next is to turn this excess fabric that I have here into a bias tape that I'm going to use for the neckline of this dress. If you want to cut facing, you can go ahead and cut facing for your fabric and use that, okay. So what I'm going to do also is to sew my darts, okay. I know where my dart is. I'll go on to sew it. You can use a pin to transfer the darts from your paper to your fabric, or just go ahead and remark that where it is. But you need to remember that you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so take note of that when marking your darts. So I'll go on to sew my darts and make my bias tape. I've gone ahead to sew my darts on the fabric, and what I'm going to do next is to sew the shoulder seam and the side seam. So I'll place the back piece on top of the front piece with right sides touching. I'll go on to sew the side seam by a 1/2 inch seam allowance, sew the shoulder seam by a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After sewing the bodice, this is what I have. Because Ankara comes in length of 44-45, I'm going to have to add a band to this in order for us to be able to, have enough length of this dress. So just a minor adjustment to the front pattern. Remember, in my pattern, I made this place to be about 2.5 inch in order to add our strap to it or belt to it. But now I've reduced it to 1 inch. What we have here is measuring 2 inches, which will have half an inch seam allowance for the neckline and half an inch seam allowance at the waist area. So the remaining will be 1 inch. Now I'll be adding a band to this to make up for that, and this band is measuring 2.5 inches. Okay, we'll join half an inch to the waist here, another half an inch will be joined to the flare part. So what will be left will be 1.5 inches. By the time we add that 1.5 inch to this 1 inch, the total will come to 2.5 inches. So that is going to be the length of the belt that we are going to cut for this fabric. So what I'm going to do right now is to take this to my sewing machine. I'm going to sew the piece onto the waist of the bodice. After joining the band to the bodice, this is what we have. I've made the bias tape for it, so I'm going to use this bias tape to enclose the neckline of the dress. So guys, before you go ahead and cut the skirt part, you need to make sure that you measure the entire length of your bodice. Okay, so what I have here is 27.25. If I remove half an inch, which we are going to use to attach to the belt, that will leave me with 26.75. So this 26.75, we are going to multiply it by 2. And after multiplying it by 2, I got 53.5. Now, this 53.5 is what I'm supposed to use to calculate for the waist circumference of the skirt piece. But because it is not going to be achievable with the Ankara fabric and the style of skirt that I'm going for, okay, I'm going to use a different method, which I'm going to explain to us as we go along in this video. But if you have a fabric length that is up to about 60, you can go ahead and, use this method to cut a flare for your dress. So let's just get right into the skirt part. Now for this skirt piece, okay, you can decide to go with, gathers. If you go with gathers, you're going to have more than enough fabric for your wrap dress because you're going to be doing sort of like a straight cut. If you're going with flare, the length of the fabric will be enough for 180-degree flare. But for 360-degree flare and 1440-degree flare, you're going to do sort of like a bit of joining, like the band that I did, or joining of fabric to cut your 360-degree flare. Like I was saying earlier, Ankara fabrics come in 44. I cut my own fabric into a square of 44 by 44. I folded it twice here, into 2 here, and then I folded it again into 2 here. So the length that we have here is about 22 inches. Now what we're going to do right now is to cut this flare. In order for me to do that, I'll be adding 2 inches to my waist circumference. My waist circumference is 34. 34 plus 2, that is 36. Now that 36 inches, we are going to divide it by 18.44 because we are making a 1080-degree flare. If we are making a 180-degree flare, we'll divide it by 3.14. If you're making a 360-degree flare, you divide by 6.28. If you're making a 720-degree flare, you divide by 12.16. So 1080 will be divided by 18.44. Now after dividing 36 by 18.44, I got 1.95. So I'm going to come right here now. We have 1.825 and then 2 inches. So I'll just go on to mark that 2 inches right there. So I just come right here, mark 2 inches, mark 2 inches all around like this. Okay, so just go on to mark that for yours. So this is my 2 inches. I'll be adding half an inch at the top right here. The next thing I'm going to do is to mark the length of this skirt piece, and from the line below, that's this mark below, not the half an inch that we added, okay, to this point, I have 20 inches. And if we're adding this to our bodies, that will give me about 38.5 inches. So that is fine. And this is going to be inclusive of seam allowance, but I'll be using a bias tape to turn on the end of this. So what I'm going to do is go with the 20 inches that I have here. Okay, if you want your dress to be longer, all you need to do is increase your band. But if you increase your band, it won't really give fitting to the dress. Just keep marking the 20 inches all around and joining it. The next thing I'm going to do is to cut this following the mark that I made right here, following the seam allowance mark. And I'll cut it at the bottom following the mark that I made here. So after cutting, this is what we have. So I'm just going to take this now, use it as pattern to cut out the remaining 2 pieces. So after cutting the 3 pieces that we need, this is what I have. The next thing I'm going to do right now is to cut open one end for all the three so we can join the pieces together. And after cutting, I'm going to take each piece and join it to the other piece with right side stitching so that we can have our 1080-degree flare all sewn up. Okay, so guys, after joining the pieces of the skirt to form the 1080-degree flare, this is it right here. Okay, it looks like a lot of fabric. It is actually quite a lot because we used about 5 yards for this. I went on to measure this and I have 19 inches on fold, and that will come to 38 inches, which means I am short of about 15.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is cut a piece of fabric that is going to be about 17 inches long. We're going to attach it to only one side of this skirt piece, and this is the part that is going to be on the inside of the dress. It's not going to show by the time we wrap it. So we're doing a bit of joining right here. Here is the extra piece of fabric that I'm going to add to my Ankara fabric to accommodate for the loss of inches that I have. Okay, remember that the entire waist measurement for my bodice is 53.5 inches, and if I was to cut my Ankara fabric to that, the skirt part is going to be very, very short, and I did not want to have to make a very, very huge, waistband that I was attaching to the bodice. I didn't want that, so this is what I've decided to do. Okay, so I'm just going to attach this piece of fabric to this flare piece that we cut out by a 1/2 inch. After attaching the extra piece of fabric here, okay, this is the stitch right here that we can see. I went on to cover the other edge, that's the opposite end where we have all flare. I covered it with a bias tape to seal off the raw edges. Then I'll get my front piece. I'm going to place it right sides touching right sides, okay, making sure that I leave 1/2 inch out from this edge because we are still going to attach the belt piece to this part. Okay, so I leave 1/2 inch. So this is how I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew up. So did you see that? And then I'll go on to sew by a 1/2 inch from the edge here all the way down to the other end. So I've joined the skirt piece to the bodice. I made sure there's a bit of an allowance for us to add our belt piece. Okay, so after sewing it, this is what we have. I used a bias tape to conceal the raw edge on this side. Now what we are going to do is to work on the belt and then attach it to this part. So here is my belt fabric. Okay, my belt fabric is measuring 6 inches in width and the length is 57 inches. So what I want to do to this belt piece is to fold it with right side stitching. I'm going to come right here, want to make the belt a little bit pointed. I mark 2 inches and I'll connect that 2 inches to this edge here, just like this. All right, cut this part out and I'll go on to sew my belt piece by a 1/4 inch, this length here, and then all the way to the top, making sure that what I have at the top is 2.5 that will fit around the edge of the wrap dress, which is what I have right there. Okay, so I'll go on to sew the belt piece. Whatever I do for this piece, I'll repeat for this other piece. So after sewing the belt pieces together, what I'm going to do next is to come right at this tip, trim it off, come right here as well, trim it off. Then I'm going to turn my belt piece right sides out and we are going to press it. So after turning and pressing my belt, what I'm going to do next is to attach each belt piece to this part of the bodice. Okay, from the slant at the front part of the bodice, I'm just going to place one belt piece and sew it down. I'll repeat the same thing for the other side as well. Attach the belt to this side and then sew down. After sewing the belt onto the bodice, this is what we have. I like to make the belt really long so that it wraps around my body twice. So the belt length is 57 inches. And what you will need to do in order for you to be able to wrap this around your body is to open up your side seam. Okay, so you can do that initially when you're sewing your side seam. Just stop at a point, go back and forth in order to secure that area. Skip about the size of your belt. Okay, skip about that size and then go on to stitch the remainder of your bodice down. So I just opened it up, secure the two ends, and this belt is going to pass through this side in order for me to wrap this around my body. So the next thing we're going to work on now is to cut out our sleeves. Here is the fabric for our sleeve. I have this straight line right here, which is where we are going to be taking all our measurements from. What I've done is to mark my cap's height of 5 3/4 inches. Then I have my shoulder to elbow marked out here, which is 14 inches, and then the sleeve length of 19 inches with seam allowance of 1 inch at the bottom. So I drew a straight line along those points. Now the next one we're going to do is to mark our round sleeve or our bicep measurement divided by 2. Mine is 13. 13 divided by 2 is 6.5. So I mark 6.5 here. My elbow circumference is also 13. Okay, normally it is 12 if I'm measuring my hand straight like this, but because I flexed my arm and took my measurements, I have 13, so that place is not tight when I flex my arm. That is why I'm going with 13 inches. So 13 divided by 2 is 6.5. I'll come right here and mark that. And then for the circumference around my arm, for the 3/4 parts, because we're making a 3/4 sleeve, it is 10 inches. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So I come right here and mark 5 inches. Okay, I come at the bottom as well, mark 5 inches. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to come to this point where we marked our bicep circumference divided by 2. We're going to connect it to the top line here to form a diagonal line. Okay, so I'll come right there and draw my diagonal line. And we're going to measure that diagonal line. And after measuring, I came to about 8.5 inches. If we divide that by 2, that will give us 4.25 inches. And if we divide this 4.25 inches by 2, it is going to give us 2.125 inches. So I'm going to mark that 2.125 inches here. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is to come up by 3/4 inches. That's where I marked the 4.25 inches, and where I marked the 2.25 inches, I'm going to come downwards by 1/4 inch. Okay, at this shoulder line here, I'm going to mark 1.5 inches from the fold of the sleeve. So remember that our sleeve is folded into 2, so I mark 1.5 inches. And what we're going to do is to connect it like this. Okay, so let me start from the bottom so you see what I'm doing. So I'll connect this point to the 1/4 inch that we marked here, and that 1/4 inch, I'm going to connect it to the 3/4 inches that is right here, and then the 3/4 inches will be connected to this 1.5 inches that we marked here. Okay, so just go on to create a curve along those points. So what I'm going to do next now is to connect from this point here, that's around our bicep, to our elbow, from our elbow to our 3/4 sleeve length. Okay, so you will notice that there is a bit of a comma to our sleeve because of this, how would I put it, because of this shape that you can see here. What I would advise you to do is to just slightly curve it out a bit. Okay, just slightly curve it out a bit. You still have enough to accommodate for your elbow. All right, so now that this is done, I'm going to come right at the bottom. We need to accommodate for this slant that we have here in the seam allowance. So from this point, I'm just going to create another slant. Okay, you can make it really wide. If it's too wide, you can always trim it later, but if it's too small, you're going to have an issue sewing your sleeve up. Then I'll come right here, add a 1 inch seam allowance to the side seam of the sleeve, or to the seam of the sleeve. Okay, so I'm going to come right here, add 1 inch, and then for the sleeve head part, I'll be adding 1/2 inch to my sleeve head. So just like this, I add 1/2 inch. Okay, so this is what I have for my sleeve, and I'll go on to cut it out following the seam allowance markings that I have made on the fabric. By all means, you can go on to connect from this point all the way to your 3/4 sleeve length. Okay, you can go on to do that. Like I was saying, if I should go ahead and do that, I'm going to lose a lot right here. Okay, in fact, I'm going to lose about 1 inch, and if you multiply that by 2, because it's on the 2 sides, that will be 2 inches. So this place is going to be really tight for me around my elbow, really tight. Number one, my elbow circumference is even 6 inches, so you can see that I have already sort of like cut out more than my elbow circumference. Can you see what I'm talking about? So after cutting my sleeve out, I'm going to replicate it for the other sleeve. Like I always say in my videos, always make sure that your sleeve head matches with your armhole circumference. So if I should measure this now, I have about 9 inches. My armhole is 18. 18 divided by 2 is 9. Okay, and then I have my 1 inch seam allowance that I added. So just make sure that your sleeve head matches with your armhole circumference, and that's exactly what you should have on the armhole of your dress. Okay, once you have sewn it up. If you don't have that on your dress, trim your armhole, make adjustments to your armhole, trim it to your normal armhole circumference. So now that I have my 2 sleeves, what I'm going to do is to take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to be sewing the side seam by the 1-inch seam allowance that I gave to it. Okay, sew like this and then come right down like this. Okay, so after sewing my sleeve by the seam allowance, this is what we have. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to turn it right side out. I made sure that I notched the middle of the sleeve head, and like I said, we're going to turn this right side out. And what we're going to do is to insert the sleeve into the bodice like this with right sides touching, making sure that the shoulder seam matches with the notched center of the sleeve. Okay, and I'm going to sew from here all the way to the bottom here. Do the same thing for the other side, sew from the top all the way to the other side, and then I'll go on to hem my sleeves.
So after sewing the sleeves, this is what we have. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, turn on the bell so you get updates when I post new videos, and I'll see you in my next tutorial. Bye.